Spectacular Spider-Man is widely renowned to be one of the best Spider-Man shows ever created, and that's for really good reason. As it comes to a high school level Spider-Man, the show does an amazing job at setting up not only Peter, but also setting up Spider-Man himself, as well as setting up this idea of both consequences and successes in life for Peter, whether it's either him as Spider-Man or him in his normal civilian life. In my last video, I covered the first 2 episodes of the show and how it starts to set up the world that we will come to see this Spider-Man live in and also operate in as Peter Parker. And I think it was a good way for me to segue into what I want to talk about today, which is a theme this show always gets right. It's the idea of responsibility as well as the consequences that come with said responsibility, whether they be positive or negative. As of where Peter Parker is right now, he is currently struggling to try and find any source of income to hopefully help his Aunt May pay for bills, especially considering the fact that Peter himself had recently just found out his new ESU internship doesn't pay anything, and so he has started to try and take pictures for the Daily Bugle. Unfortunately for Peter, he's not exactly very good at taking said photos, and Aunt May is still dealing with financial struggles, ones that Peter wants to promise to fulfill and help solve, but he's not exactly sure of how to go about doing it just yet. It also doesn't help that Peter is still struggling with his 10 p.m. curfew, and even when he brags to his Aunt May about it, she pretty much just says, dude, you made it barely on time. That's no celebration. It also doesn't help that the next day at school, Peter's just casually getting bullied by Flash, but decides to put on his spider moves. Peter wants to essentially no longer be bullied and treated like shit at school, but unfortunately, to keep his secret identity, he has to let Flash continue to beat up on him, because if he wanted all the glory, dude wouldn't wear the mask. But it isn't necessarily completely doom and gloom for Peter. For example, when he goes back to his ESU lab, what he ends up finding out is that Dr. Kirk Connors has somehow managed to regenerate his lost arm completely. And for a time being, it is exceptionally exciting. They celebrate, they throw a party, but unfortunately for everyone there, this was a very short-lived celebration. As it turns out, the lizard part of Kirk Connors' body was taking over. He had injected himself with an experimental serum using the DNA of a lizard that was charged by Electro's electricity that eventually just would cause him to turn himself into a lizard, one that doesn't care about anything other than eating its own babies and whatever flesh it can get its hands on, much to Peter's shock. And while Eddie Brock jumps into action in person and Gwen decides to stay back and take action at the lab, Peter runs away. And obviously we as the viewer know that he's running away to go be Spider-Man. But to everybody around him, Peter appears as though he is running away to avoid responsibility. He's running away because he is afraid. And Gwen calls him out on this.
I should get going too. Aunt May will ground me if I'm not home by 10.
Pete, you can't leave now. We have to help.
Well, I can't be late. She worries.
Peter, of course, as we know, is doing everything in his power to try and benefit the situation for the people around him. He knows his best efforts are not going to be left as Peter Parker, but instead his best efforts are going to be used through Spider-Man. It's a common storytelling trope that we have seen with Peter as his duality of life since, well, the very beginning of Spider-Man comics. But I like the way in which this show goes about it. Mainly because a lot of the times when we would see Spider-Man in these shows have to choose between being Peter or being, well, Spider-Man, he would often get off with minor consequences, but nothing too major. But throughout this entire episode, what we end up seeing is these consequences for Peter are not only in the short term, but they are long-lasting. The choices Peter chooses to make in this episode have a ripple effect for the rest of this show in its entirety. It's not just some little one-off thing. And to make all of this even worse, Peter puts all of this responsibility solely on his shoulders. All of this responsibility, all of this pain, everything he's going through he puts solely on himself. He refuses to let anybody help because he believes that this is the only way forward and that he is the only qualified person to deal with these things. Mind you, Peter is about 16 years old right now. He's still really just a kid, and he won't let anybody else help him, not even Eddie Brock, who is an adult in college, because Peter knows that Eddie Brock is going to be qualified to get himself hurt, whereas he is far less likely to actually be injured. So he's unlikely and almost unwilling to take any sort of support from anybody else, which just makes the situation even sadder, in my opinion. But what all of this does present is one half-decent opportunity for Peter. While he is fighting the lizard and trying to desperately cure Curt Connors, he does see an opportunity to potentially win the Bugle's prize money for taking photos of Spider-Man during this entire situation. An issue that would help solve his financial problems with Aunt May. He seeks to fulfill his responsibilities in an interesting manner. Peter not only is responsible for his aunt, but he's also responsible for the city of New York, for helping to take care of Curt Connors in the most ethical way possible, while also trying to make the money he needs to take care of his family in a decent manner. I love this show because the responsibility that Peter faces isn't just one fold. He has to pick and choose from multiple different alleyways of responsibility, and sometimes you just can't win it all, because that's realistic to life itself.
Did you see? There's no shots of Billy or Dr. Connors or anything to prove that he was the lizard.
And that's supposed to... Bro, you ditched the antidote effort to win a contest.
Eddie, it's all right. Besides, I'm not exactly in a position to throw stones.
To the people around him, it appears as though Peter absolutely abandoned Dr. Curt Connors, while the rest of them at ESU chose to put their lives in danger to help save Curt Connors. Peter chose to run away and use this as an opportunity to make money. He has basically eroded one of the only few people that enjoyed having his presence around in his life. This is a permanent change for the show in the fact that Peter will never work at ESU's lab again, at least not in the same capacity that he currently does, especially not being liked at all by just about anybody who works there. Peter isn't welcome there at all. He lost one of the best opportunities he had ever been given because he had to be Spider-Man, because he had to choose that responsibility first. And this leads Peter to wanting to give it all up, to turn it in so that he can just be Peter Parker. But it's the words of his uncle that continually make him torture himself, essentially. His twisted idea of what Uncle Ben said about great power and great responsibility that continues to push him to doing what he does every single night.
Spider-Man's no magic wand, but thanks to the webhead, Kurt's cured, and Billy gets his father back. So what if nobody threw a parade? Spidey stays because Spidey's needed. For now, anyway.
And Peter ultimately chooses to continue being Spider-Man because he sees the good that he's doing as outweighing the negative, which I don't know for how much longer he might see it like that, because in the very next episode, the entire theme of it essentially is that Peter has landed his dream job at the Bugle, something that will help for him to pay bills by taking pictures of himself while he's doing something already. But even just the thought of Aunt May having to pay these bills still weighs on Peter heavily. It's a heavy theme throughout this episode that Peter feels extremely burdened by these bills, even if Aunt May tries her best to shield him from this responsibility because she knows he's a young kid, one who has other things he wants to do. For example, Peter promised that he would help his best friend Harry Osborn study for his next test, promised that he would help Harry do well on this test. And Peter knows to some extent that Harry's father is almost always disappointed in him and disapproving of him. And Peter knows to some small extent that potentially helping Harry pass this test might earn him some leeway with his own dad, something Harry is so desperate to get from his father, that appreciation and that love. And while Peter might not recognize it at its most deep and full potential, he still sees it minorly. But he ends up putting the idea of helping Harry on the shelf instead choosing to go get his money from the Daily Bugle first, because he wants to secure his job with J. Jonah Jameson, and as well secure the check that he will be getting from his job. And also hit on Betty Brant, because Peter is a shameless 16-year-old. And despite all of the sadness Peter has recently faced in the last episode, he's at least getting the win there. And in his life as Spider-Man, he's at least getting the wins. He just simply has to deal with Marco and O'Hearn for like the 92nd time in this show. Those two are some of my favorite reoccurring early season villains because they're literally jokes. But unfortunately for Peter, it's not just them. Dude was completely set up and now has to face a literal new supervillain that is seemingly only out for him, all while he's also being compacted in a trash compactor. Quite literally, Peter's life is starting to reek of shit. And it's not necessarily going too great for the guy, despite the minor wins he seems to pick up. And to make it all worse, the one thing that was going well in his life just kind of got ruined, as Peter's check just got completely destroyed by all of that, and his pictures are completely unusable from that night. So dude lost in two respects. He also abandoned Harry completely and forgot to help him at all, something that Harry is upset about but still willing to give Pete a second chance for, something Pete promises to go and do. And to make things triple bad, the dude smells terrible because he quite literally smells like a garbage can, considering he got crushed in a dump. So now Peter just got outed in front of everybody in gym class that he musty, and ain't nobody want that. That's like the worst possible thing that could happen. And because Peter can't win at anything, when he decides to pass Gwen the ball, he hits her in the back of the head as though their relationship wasn't strained enough already. And, of course, Peter is still facing different pressures at his job. For example, Robbie doesn't believe that his camera photo quality is good enough for the Bugle.
But the photos themselves... You have your camera on you?
She's kind of hard to keep in focus.
This won't cut it. You want to be a Bugle freelancer? You take that check and invest in a serious camera.
Which leads Peter to having to make a choice that nobody would want to make. The idea that he either has to buy something new for his job in order to do it better, or help Aunt May pay the bills, because that's the whole reason he decided to do this in the first place.
I'm almost done here. Just paying bills. Or rather, deciding which ones I can hold off paying.
Well, I think I might hold off on the gas bill.
Peter had to make the choice to actively not immediately pay the bills for Aunt May, because he believed that he needed a new camera. He wanted to get that new camera. He wanted to do something for himself for the first time. And in the process, realized he completely forgot about Harry. The test was today, and Peter didn't help Harry study at all. He has successfully alienated the only two people that have been friends with him for years and that have cared about him over the last 2 episodes. Peter is all alone, at least temporarily. So all he has currently is Spider-Man and his job. And in all honesty, outside of the fact that Peter typically gets his ass beat pretty often in every single one of these episodes, his life as Spider-Man tends to go very well. For Peter, this is his outlet, his ability to make jokes at the expense of his villains, while also feeling like he is doing something more to help the people of the city. As many problems as Spider-Man brings to Peter's life, it is also potentially his greatest source of joy, which is really messed up in all honesty and kind of deserves its own video essay itself on just how messed up that is. But regardless, Peter is doing fairly well in that aspect of his life, which is great because the dude doesn't have much else going for him. His friends are pissed. He is currently struggling on whether or not he should invest in a new camera, which he chose to do earlier in the episode. He chose to buy that brand new camera instead of helping his aunt pay for bills and stuff, which never really sat right with Peter. As a matter of fact, he felt miserable because he chose to do that for a majority of this episode. It was something that slowly was eating at him. Even though this was the first time in the show Peter had actively went out of his way to try and do something nice for himself. But as well in the process, we have to remember Peter also managed to completely abandon one of his closest friends in doing so. In choosing to chase the bag, he left Harry in the dust. And while you could argue that Harry failing the test is more on himself than it is Peter, because he doesn't necessarily need Peter to pass the test, it doesn't help when your best friend, who is a genius, legitimately promises to help you, and they don't. Which is honestly very sad on Harry's aspect and on his side. Peter doesn't know the full ramifications of what will happen to Harry because of this test failure, but I think on some deeper level, Peter understands that he really messed up in that situation. But at the end of the episode and at the end of the day, Peter knows that he is trying his best to do what he believes is best, not only for the city, but for the people around him in his life. Peter decided to trade in his camera at the end of the episode because he decided that he wants to help his Aunt May, and to him, that's more important. She is one of his responsibilities. Oddly enough, a quote that he took from one of his villains, something that I honestly love.
But a man has to honor his responsibilities. You're one of mine. Aunt May, please. Let me help.
I accept. If you agree to set aside 10% of every check to save for that camera.
The episode ends on a really positive note. Not only does Peter help to get to pay the bills and take care of his responsibilities with Aunt May, but he also gets the ability to help take care of himself in buying that camera. For Peter, this is a really nice and sweet ending. But as I mentioned before, this is a tale of threes, so Peter also still has to reconcile with the fact that not everything is perfect. But this episode is far more positive than the last two we just talked about. Peter is kind of, right now at least, trying to avoid going to the fall formal, something he's not interested in at all, yet his aunt seems to want him to go with a girl who has this amazing personality. A joke that I didn't get as a kid and took me until I hit high school to realize why Peter would shudder every single time he heard that. But more importantly and more poignantly to the episode, one of Midtown High's starting wide receivers recently just got injured, which means there is an open spot on the football team for anyone to take. It is also worth mentioning that in between the last episode and this one, Peter has somewhat mended his relationship with his friends. They're not completely cool with him yet, but they're still able to actually be friends, which is fairly realistic to how friendship works in real life. So it didn't really upset me that there wasn't a huge falling out currently. But essentially, there is a position open on the football team, and both Peter and Harry Osborn decide to try out for said position. Harry wants to do this because he wants to seek validation in a way that he can get from his father that he seemingly isn't getting at home no matter what he does. And of course, Peter sees being on the football team as something cool to do, especially with his Spider-Man abilities. He could easily become a wide receiver on his football team, and it really wouldn't take much for him to be able to do it at all. And so on day one of football tryouts, Peter Parker immediately just starts showing out everybody. Because not only does the dude have super sticky hands, bro's got spider sense, which essentially means that ain't nobody tackling Peter at all. No matter what happens, nobody's tackling Peter. And so a bunch of dudes line up and try out, but really the only three people who are standing out of the two positions that are open are Hobie Brown, who just doesn't speak, which is hilarious, Harry Osborn, and Peter Parker. Of course, Harry isn't as great as some of the other people, but Peter just absolutely dominates completely. At first, Peter wanted to sort of make Harry look decent, but halfway through the football tryouts, I think the idea of being on the football team really stood out to Peter, as he quite literally decides to dominate at football completely. I mean, the dude pretty much can't get tackled and can't be touched because he knows it's coming. And even though this is giving him an unfair advantage, Peter is still trying to rationalize this idea that playing sports is okay and that using his abilities is okay, because I think deep down Peter knows that it isn't alright what he's doing, even though he wants it to be okay, because he compares it to his other classmates, and when they use their fantastical human abilities, it's not an issue.
Yeah, I could get used to this. I mean, sure, I went a little arachnobatic on Kong, But it's not like I cheated. No one yells at Flash when he uses his natural talents.
But while Peter is spending more time at school trying to join the football team, he is ignoring his responsibilities as Spider-Man, which doesn't help when one of his famously reoccurring villains, Slint Marko, actually has powers now and has become the Sandman. But Peter has been willfully ignoring his duties as Spider-Man because he wants to be a football star and he wants to be on a football team because it's something genuinely interesting that he wants to do. We see his internal conflict with wanting to be Spider-Man as well as wanting to be on the football team later in the episode. Because for him, it's not only just about being on the football team, it's about the clout that comes with being on the football team. For example, he starts to get a lot more attention from Liz Allen once again, someone we know that he likes because he's doing well at football tryouts.
Forget football. As soon as school's out, I'm webbing up Sandman once
Hey,
and for—
Petey. Nice moves yesterday. Heard it's down to you, Harry, and Hobie Brown. Good luck.
Of course, Sandman will still be around after tryouts, right?
What I really like is that we get this montage of not only Peter doing extraordinarily well at football practice, but also this montage of Sandman, who is absolutely sweeping the streets from money, basically using his abilities, even though Sandman is really terrible at thievery, which is hilarious. Also, another thing in this episode that is so funny is Kong is so clearly a defensive tackle. Why is this man in the open field trying to make DB tackles? Like, he is nowhere close to being a defensive back. I know they probably just didn't want to draw a new DB for this, and it's easier to use existing assets, but to me, it's absolutely hilarious. Although on a far more important note, Peter necessarily hasn't let all of this go to his head. Despite how well he's doing at these tryouts, he still isn't fully given into the whole mentality behind being on the football team, being a popular cat on campus, and really doing all that. Peter instead chooses to ride the bus with Gwen instead of going with the football team and Harry out to eat dinner. He chooses to spend time with Gwen, and he chooses to spend time as Spider-Man, because that's really where his priorities lie. He's never really going to choose the football team over, well, being himself and being Spider-Man. It's not really his thing at all. Not as much as he might want it to be, because his responsibility as Spider-Man, his responsibility to take pictures for the Bugle, to pay the bills for Aunt May, and to take care of the city is far more important to him than it will ever be to be a football star, as much as he might want to be one. It's actually a conflict that we had seen played out, not in this show necessarily, but in the original comics and in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man films, where we see Peter wants to be a professional wrestler to take on the identity of being a popular showman. It's often a trope we see for Spider-Man. This show decided to handle it because he's still in high school. They chose to handle it as him wanting to be a student athlete rather than being a superhero and a student. And I love the way in which they went about it because it felt realistic to me. It reminded me of Ultimate Comics when Peter decided he wanted to play basketball, which, wow, he would be so suited to basketball, it'd be insane. But also, another thing that happens in this episode is Harry straight up confronts Peter and tells Peter straight up, "This is my dream, not yours." Peter didn't even want to try out for the football team until he heard people was doubting him that he could do it. And so he let his ego go and decided he wanted to do it. For Harry, it was his dream to be on a football team, and for Peter, it wasn't really. For Peter, this was just about clout and just doing it because he knows he can, not because it's necessarily what he wants. And so by the end of the episode, Peter ultimately makes the decision to just sell the last half of the tryouts because he knows there's only 2 open spots, and he knows Harry wants it more than he does. He also knows it's more ethical to give it to Harry than it is for him. And so Peter sacrifices the clout, he sacrifices Liz Allen, and he sacrifices everything else, all in the attempt to hopefully make his life and his friend's life a little easier. Peter made this choice consciously and willingly, and honestly, it was very mature of him. It ain't necessarily the ending that Peter really wanted for himself, but he understands it's the best outcome at the end of the day. The show and Peter is all about making sacrifices, and so he chose to make the sacrifice.
Hey, if I wanted all the glory, I wouldn't wear a mask. So Harry gets his dream, and I watch from the sidelines.
Ice cream?
Of course, that has its benefits too.
I absolutely love the way this episode ends, because it's been a prevalent theme throughout the last 3 episodes that no matter how bad it's getting for Peter, he has a support system around him. No matter how bad it gets, he's always going to get wins in different ways. Shout out Randy. I love that man. In every single episode, we see him taking big L's, but we also see him catching a ton of small W's. It's part of the reason I love this show so much, because it shows you the bad and the good. Something that I felt that Zeb Wells' Spider-Man comic book run lacked a lot of. It's why I stopped reading it, because Peter was just taking nothing but L's, and his W's were so rare and far between, it was almost hurtful to watch as a Spider-Man fan. And that's something I really love about this show, is they balanced it so well. The theme of responsibility and the toll that takes on somebody so young. Peter essentially lost all of his innocence and is losing his childhood to this responsibility. So it's important to give him a few W's as he does so. I truly, truly love this show, and I'm so blessed to be able to cover it, and I'm really glad I am covering it. So thank you all for watching. Once again, thank you all so much for watching. Your viewership helps me to propel my channel and for me to keep making videos like this. So if you want to leave a like, that helps out the channel a lot. If you want to sub, it's free. You can always unsubscribe later. If you want to leave a dislike, please leave a dislike. And then down below in the comments, tell me why you disliked the video. Constructive criticism helps me to make my channel a better place for everybody to watch videos. As well, I do run a Patreon for $1 a month. Not only do you get access to each and every one of my videos early, you get to see them completely unedited, meaning that you don't have to see freeze frames or text on screen, none of that stuff. As well, through all of that, you will also receive access to my Discord, where you can interact with not only me, but my community as a whole, with a more direct line of contact. And as well, I host weekly watch parties. And if you are in the $5 or above tier, you get shouted out at the end of each and every one of my videos, just like these lovely people here. So shout out EastSibert13, shout out Gabriel Lafonte, Transgears1, VideoGamer75, shout out GoldenBoy420, shout out Dakota Rawson, shout out Donovan Gomez, and shout out MCBomb27. You all are the GOATs, and I hope you all have an absolutely fantastic day. And to the rest of you that stayed all the way to the end, it's going to be okay. I understand things look really bad right now, but it is going to be okay.